Hope your week is off to a great start. I'm Min Sun-hee with our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the show.
Good to be back, thanks.
The weather has gotten much colder since we last met, and because of the plunge in temperature, some are already battling against the seasonal flu. Is there any special remedy in your respective countries against the common flu or the cold?
Yeah, usually French people would mix hot tea with honey to avoid flu, but it doesn't work that much. I mean, this is why I'm trying. I still got the flu, so maybe we should try other methods.
I see. What about in the U.S.?
In the U.S., there's the chicken soup, canard, which I'm not sure if it actually works. And then I grew up in the South, and we had this sort of, I don't know if it was Appalachian tradition, where maybe a little bit of honey and lemon and actually whiskey as kind of a cheap cold medicine for children. So yeah, I mean, I don't think they do that anymore, but that was.
I see.
I've been here in South Korea a while, so I'm using the Korean quite simple remedy. Turn up the ondol, the floor heating, to make sure you stay warm at home.
Right. Well, speaking of turning up the ondol, Seoul and Beijing have agreed to move beyond their year-long dispute over the former's deployment of a missile shield here on the Korean Peninsula. We have details in our first report.
It's official. Korea-China relations have finally normalized. On October 31st, the foreign ministries of Korea and China issued a joint statement on improved bilateral relations. Also, the two nations are set to hold a summit at the 2017 APEC meeting.
모든 분야의 교류 협력을 정상적인 발전되도록 조속히 회복시켜 나가기로 한 합의 이행의 첫 단계 조치라 할 수 있겠습니다.
Korea-China relations, which were frozen due to the thawed deployment issue, showed signs of gradual thawing after the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, which established China's new leadership. On October 13th, a currency swap agreement between Korea and China was extended.
통화 스와프 만기 연장 합의를 계기로 우리 정부는 다른 분야에서도 한국과 중국 간의 교류 협력 관계가 조속히 활성화되기를 기대하고 있습니다.
On October 24th, the defense leaders of Korea and China held their first bilateral talks in nearly 2 years during the ADMM-Plus meeting. On October 27th, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spoke of improving relations with Korea for the first time since the National Congress.
我们也愿意同韩方共同努力，来克服目前两国关系中发展中面临的一些障碍，逐渐恢复两国的各个领域的。
At the same time, foreign media outlets quickly reported on the news of normalized bilateral relations. Korea and China have finally resolved the thawed conflict, and much focus is now on improving relations between the two countries.
Now that the two countries have agreed to move beyond their differences, what is an area of particular interest to you in bilateral ties? For example, are you interested in seeing how economic relations will span out, or political ties? We'll start with you, Frank.
I'm interested to see how soon they'll unwind these economic retaliatory measures that China took in opposition to THAAD. The agreement that the two countries made was, you know, about promises that South Korea made, and you know, we've seen some sort of limited relaxation or removal of these retaliatory measures. If you talk to people in industry, though, they'll say it'll take several months, as these these economic sort of sanctions that China imposed actually cost South Korea a lot of money. I've seen various estimates. One suggested that Lotte lost something in upwards of $1.5 billion in shutting down a number of stores in China, and then other estimates showed that the overall loss was approaching $20 billion even. So it'll be interesting to see how South Korea can recover and how quickly, tourism and talent, entertainment exchanges and these other sort of economic sanctions and measures that have restricted trade between the two countries, how quickly they get unwound.
What about you, Matt? What areas of particular interest to you?
Well, I agree with Frank. It would be interesting to see if the sort of better ties lead to better or ending of these retaliatory steps we've seen, and how many or how much of those steps were homegrown, like how much of Lotte's problems in China or the tourism problems that we've seen were because the Chinese public didn't want to come, or whether because they were restricted by the government. I think that's in some areas that's still an open question. I think for me the more fascinating piece, because I don't necessarily agree that the economic retaliation was all that important in terms of the overall picture of the trade between the two countries. The bigger picture for me is whether better ties between China and South Korea in some ways cause separation between the United States, or in this sort of what we've seen as a growing, warming relationship with Japan in some ways. To me, that's more fascinating.
Do you suppose continued retaliation on the part of Beijing would have proved to be of little benefit to Beijing itself?
I think, there was already South Korea. South Korea is, China is its main trading partner. I think the main problem for China was the political impact, like having a bad relationship with a neighbor who is so important politically. It's, especially with the rising North Korean threat. And you see that Japan and the US, they have a very strong stance now related to North Korea. And somehow South Korea and China want a softer approach, and I think I can see some of their interests align here. And I think it made sense for Beijing to try to restore the relationship, because now you have to find a solution with about the North Korean crisis.
And speaking of Beijing's international ties, what diplomatic path do you see the Chinese president adopting in his second term in office, Frank?
Well, I think we can actually look to the United States and see what they do in their 2 terms. The first term of the American presidency tends to be aimed at getting reelected. And then the second term is one in which they try to develop an international legacy. We saw this with Obama. First term gets reelected. Second term concludes the Iran and the Cuba deal. We might see the same thing out of China. I think the second term of a Chinese premier now can be viewed as really something of a given. The first term, if a Chinese premier only makes it through a first term, we could say that he's been recalled if he doesn't do another term. So that 10-year term is kind of a given. And I think we should look for Xi to try to make more of an international impact in terms of its position as a G2 nation.
Well, opposition against the deployment of thawed was also witnessed here in Korea. Do you suppose the opposition here in Korea will ease now that Beijing seems to have somewhat accepted this reality, Matt?
I'm not sure. I think there was some concern about the retaliation that led to the size and the intensity of the protests increasing, but the protests were there before the retaliation, and they were peace-related or environment-related, or just local concerns about infringement on their region. And I think those concerns will remain despite the change in the policy.
Do you agree with that,
Yeah,
Fred?
I think so too. I totally agree with Matt. The people in Seouls area who protest the thawed do it because they don't want to be involved in a conflict. They're afraid of becoming target. They're afraid of the potential harmful effect of the waves from the radar. All these concerns. I don't think China is actually their main concern, so we'll probably continue to see some protest there.
Well, in this next report, we take a look at the change in ties between Seoul and Beijing following the deployment of the thawed system here in the country.
Diplomatic relations between Korea and China, which had been frozen for over a year, have finally thawed. Since the two countries established formal diplomatic ties in 1992, Korea and China recently faced the biggest conflict in their relations. At the center of it all was thawed. The Korean government, which had been discussing whether or not to host the thawed system, officially announced its deployment in July of last year. China, which has been steadfast in its opposition to the thawed deployment on the Korean Peninsula, immediately retaliated.
美韩部署萨德半岛系统，不利于朝鲜半岛的无核化，不利于维护朝鲜半岛的和平稳定，不利于各方通过对话协商解决有关问题。
Since then, the relationship between Korea and China began souring rapidly, which also had a negative impact on the economy and cultural sector. Chinese citizens continue to boycott Korean products, from confectionery and beverages to cosmetics.
我们新城超市第一时间下架韩国乐天食品，坚决拥护中国共产党。
A number of Korean companies withdrew from China. Meanwhile, the popularity of Hallyu content, which was favored among the Chinese, declined as well. However, with the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China on October 18th, the Chinese government began speaking of improving relations with Korea.
两国在经贸、人文等各个领域的合作，给两国人民带来了实实在在的好处和利益。
On October 30th, Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa, who attended a parliamentary audit, mentioned the improvement of relations with China.
네, 새 정부 출범 이후 양국은 7월 6일 날의 그 정상회담을 포함해서 각 수준에서 자주 소통을 했고 당면 현안 해소를 위해서 노력하고 있습니다.
On October 31st, just a day after Foreign Minister Kang's remarks, the two countries released a joint statement on improved bilateral relations. And during the 2017 APEC meeting in Vietnam on November 10th, President Moon Jae-in and President Xi Jinping will hold a summit. The two leaders are expected to discuss developments in bilateral relations and address the North Korean issue.
한국은 이 사드 문제를 넘어서 양국 관계를 우리 경제 교역에 걸맞게 좀 비약적으로 발전시켜 나가야 될 그런 상황인 것 같습니다.
Korea and China have sought to seal up the thawed conflict and normalize relations. As a result, cooperation in the economic and cultural sectors are expected to recover gradually.
Well, apart from the two governments, Seoul and Beijing, who else do you suppose is welcoming the ease in ties between the two governments? We'll start with you, Fred.
I think the Korean entertainment industry will be very happy. I mean, I remember when the THAAD issue started to arise, all this, you know, the movie industry, the K-pop industry, they had so many plans, so many partnerships in China. China is a huge market, obviously. Korean culture, popular culture is popular in China. They had this, you know, co-production, and everything collapsed. And it was a huge. I mean, I know people working in China that had to, like, for the Korean entertainment industry, they had to leave. So I think they'll be very happy to be able to restart their activities.
Do you see the industry as regaining momentum in China?
I'm sure. I don't see why not. I mean, I think Korean K-pop stars and entertainers are still popular in China. The talent, the skills of the Korean entertainment industry is still there. Why not? Yeah.
How do you see regional partners, Matt, responding to the decision by the two governments to improve their ties?
Well, you know, I'm sure that we're talking about regionally. I'm sure that Japan is not exactly keen on the idea. I know that the United States is a little bit concerned about the situation, but again, it's really a relationship between the two countries. And when we're talking about economics, that's the key issue that probably drove this this decision.
It was interesting to see a response from the U.S. how they said, oh, it's nice to, you know, and this is where you get into political communication when they're not really saying what they really feel, where they said, oh, they welcome the improvement of ties between China and South Korea. In fact, I don't think, I would tend to agree with Matt that there's probably a little bit more concern in Washington about South Korea and China improving relations, given that China, as Fred mentioned, is South Korea's largest trading partner. And from a security standpoint, you know, the U.S. probably might prefer some tension in relations between South Korea and China, so that it can better, you know, maintain a sort of stopgap in terms of China's ambitions, security-wise, in the region.
But surely in dealing with North Korea's provocations, a stronger relationship here in the region would be of benefit?
Sure, that's another one. Probably the U.S. is saying we want to put as much pressure on China as we can in order to change, the decision-making process in North Korea. So again, on that same thing, a little bit of tension in that relationship might be viewed in Washington as more beneficial and drive Seoul and its security calculation westward toward Washington and toward a hardline position against North Korea. I see the position against North Korea, hardline and sort of more progressive, moving to the progressive side, moving to the engagement side with the rapprochement in relations between Seoul and Beijing.
Yeah, I agree with Frank. I think that from the U.S. perspective, any movement from South Korea towards China, even if it's relatively constructive, I mean, if they're talking well amongst each other and tensions are reduced, it still reduces the United States' influence over South Korea. And we're not just talking about now or next month or a year. It's 10 years from now or 20 years from now when China is really upset about something, or when South Korea really has to decide who its best friend in the world is. So there are long-term considerations that will be more apparent later than right now.
I mentioned this in the report, but some in the media in the US claim that Beijing probably is engaging Seoul in light of perhaps closer ties between Seoul and Washington in dealing with issues such as the North Korean nuclear and missile situation. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think anyway, historically, China and South Korea have a very close relationship. They are neighbors, they are important trade partners. I mean, I think it's natural, and I think the US should accept the evident fact that South Korea and China are neighbors and need to have a good relationship. So, you're talking about long term, but the way I see in the long term, I think everybody has an interest for the regional stability to have a good relationship.
And if you're a pessimist like me, you see South Korea once again in the middle of two other powers' tensions. And it's not necessarily fair that South Korea always has to sort of be the one in the middle.
I think in South Korea, that's something that they call the shrimp between two whales, how South Korea is trapped between the two bigger powers in navigating the international community. But as I mentioned, I think that they can also use this, they can exploit this as a competition for influence here between China and the US.
Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa, she was speaking at the parliamentary audit, and she spoke of 3 promises. Now, these remarks came a day prior to the joint statement by the foreign ministries of Seoul and Beijing. She claimed that Seoul was not considering deploying additional thawed systems, that Seoul would not join the US-led missile shield, and that the current security cooperation between Seoul and Washington as well as Tokyo will not turn into a trilateral military alliance. Opposition party politicians have denounced these remarks, and some in the media here have claimed that Seoul has essentially given in to Beijing's bullying. Frank had a really interesting outlook. You claim that it's not exactly surrendering, but rather that we have set our foot down by keeping the thawed deployed here on the peninsula. What are your thoughts, Matt?
My thoughts are that this sort of international diplomacy and the things that go on between countries is complicated, and everyone has to give a little. And in reality, those things that Seoul gave to Beijing were probably going to be the reality anyway. They just maybe weren't explicitly said in a public hearing this early in the stage. But that was here. It was going to stay here. This administration didn't want to expand it. A lot of people in the region are nervous about it becoming a permanent part of the United States missile defense system. I think that's really what China's end goal in a lot of this was. So we shouldn't really be surprised by the statement by the foreign minister. But these things are difficult, and there are always going to be political critics of any administration. Maybe not so much in China for the decisions they make, but in any democracy, when people make decisions on the international stage, there will be critics.
Right. How may Pyongyang regard the easing in ties between Seoul and Beijing, Frank?
I think that's maybe a little bit more difficult question, and I think it depends on how the two pursue relations with North Korea. We have seen movement from Seoul toward a hardline position since Moon Jae-in came to government, but we might see that shift again back toward the engagement that he promised on the campaign.
Do you forecast a shift perhaps in Pyongyang's attitude or actions in light of the closer ties between Seoul and Beijing? Fred?
I mean, I don't think so. I think now North Korean regime distrust Chinese quite a lot. So I don't think this thaw between Beijing and Seoul will change anything in the calculation made in Pyongyang.
Yeah, they seem to have made a calculation that their nuclear program is essential to their survival, regardless of anybody else's position on that matter. And so, you know, time will tell if their behavior changes, and maybe that opens up opportunities for dialogue. The real negotiating partner for them is the United States in some ways, and China, not necessarily South Korea on the major issue, which is the nuclear issue. But it's really hard to know why they make decisions the way they do, and when they make them, and how they're executed. And we really just have to judge by their actions, and that remains to be seen. So.
I have a question I want to ask you guys. I read a report that there are back-channel negotiations taking place between Pyongyang and Washington, the so-called New York Channel. What do you make of that? And do you think that has the potential to unwind the tension between the U.S. and North Korea?
I don't know. I think it's the same New York Channel that all us journalists try to use to get into the country. And it's not very successful, because I've been trying for a year to get into the country and haven't been able to. So there was that report, and certainly there are through other governments opportunities for the United States and others to speak to them, to have these back-channel discussions. But we've seen President Trump publicly undermining his Secretary of State for talking about trying to start dialogue. So even if they were fruitful, and I'm skeptical that they might be, it doesn't seem like the U.S. President is all that concerned about pursuing them.
Well, the presidents of Korea and China have agreed to hold talks on the sidelines of the 17th APEC meeting in Vietnam later this week. What might be on the agenda of that summit? Fred?
I mean, I do hope they will talk about solutions and innovative solutions to the nuclear crisis. I mean, as Frank said, we might witness a shift to a more like dialogue-oriented mood. And I do hope that China and South Korea will try to advocate for a softer approach to the North Korean issue. And I hope they can coordinate their views and have some arguments to oppose to the US and Japan who are now.
I think what's interesting is what Fred left out. He left out THAAD. That's going to be off the table. That's something they're not going to talk about most likely, and will be left in the past. There were some really interesting reports about how different local governments in China and South Korea were looking forward to re-energizing their exchanges. And so I really think that China and South Korea are back on a much more cooperative path.
So do you see this latest agreement as an indication of an end to the fallout from THAAD, or just a temporary halt?
You know, it forecasts an end to the fallout from THAAD that we'll see unwind over the coming months.
I mean, I would just add to that so it's not just the entertainment industry, it's all the products that were sold to Chinese because of the entertainment industry, like cosmetics and things. And it will be interesting to see whether the domestic audience in China wants to buy those things again when they start consuming that entertainment again, or whether there really is some domestic backlash to that, and whether the political steps taken by China had some real political effect on the population. In terms of South Korea's position as the cool Asian country, even replacing Taiwan on the mainland in China.
Right, well, before we go, one final question then. What are your thoughts on today's discussion regarding the improvement in ties between Seoul and Beijing? We'll start with you, Frank.
I think it'll be interesting to see, what happens with this summit. Then we'll have a better indication of where things are going, but definitely it's a positive development, I feel, for relations between the two countries, and in general the geopolitical situation and tension on the Korean Peninsula seems like it has the potential to cool down.
Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great topic, because it's something that's really outside of the political scandal that's happened here. and obviously the provocations from North Korea. It's been one story that's really been a theme throughout the year for foreign correspondents, this sort of tension over THAAD. And so that's now apparently off the table, but we'll see, how the economic effects unwind. So it's a fascinating topic to discuss.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very interesting. We've been working on this for many months now, and it's a step. It's just a first step, but it's a step in the right direction. So it's very encouraging. Yes.
Right. Well, during their first summit on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in Germany back in July, President Xi Jinping quoted a line from President Moon Jae-in's autobiography that reads, "The waves at the back of the Yangtze River drive the waves at the front." Now, the line itself is a Chinese proverb, but it suggests a transition of all sorts. Well, with the latest accord between Seoul and Beijing, we hope that the ties between the two countries will be driven to better waves. Thank you for watching.